The prisoner sat in the cellar with his hands bound behind the chair. Blood from his split lip had dried on his collar. Captain Viktor Abakumov of Soviet military counterintelligence watched him from across the table, saying nothing. The German officer had been captured 3 hours ago near Stalingrad, carrying documents that should not have existed. Orders that described Soviet defensive positions written in perfect detail. Positions that had been classified 48 hours earlier. Abakumov knew what this meant. Someone on the Soviet side was talking. Someone was feeding the enemy information that was getting Soviet soldiers killed. His job was to find that person before more men died. Outside the cellar, the Battle of Stalingrad raged into its 3rd month. The city was being destroyed block by block. Every day, thousands of Soviet soldiers died defending positions that the enemy somehow knew about in advance. The leaks were systematic, organized, coming from somewhere inside Soviet command structure. Abakumov had been hunting traitors since the war began, but never had he seen leaks this precise, this deadly. The German officer finally spoke. His Russian was excellent, nearly accent-free. He said his name was Major Klaus Steinberg, Abwehr Intelligence Section. He said he had been operating behind Soviet lines for 6 weeks. He said his information came from a Soviet major who worked in 62nd Army headquarters. He said this Soviet major provided grid coordinates of defensive positions, troop strength numbers, artillery placements. He said the major did this because he believed Stalin had betrayed the Soviet people. He said the major's name was Dmitry Volkov. Abakumov wrote down every word. He knew the name. Major Volkov worked in signals intelligence at 62nd Army Command. He had access to everything. But Abakumov also knew that the Abwehr trained its officers to lie convincingly under interrogation. They were taught to feed false names to Soviet counterintelligence to create chaos in Soviet ranks. This was the knife edge that Abakumov walked every day. One wrong decision, and either a traitor escaped or an innocent man died. Abakumov had a wife. Her name was Antonina. They had married in 1937, just before he joined the NKVD. She was a schoolteacher in Moscow, taught mathematics to children who were now old enough to be drafted into the army. Before he left for Stalingrad, she had given him a silver watch that had belonged to her father. She had pressed it into his hand at the train station and said, "Keep this with you so you remember to come home." He had promised her he would. He had promised that when this war was over, they would have the life they had planned before everything changed. The watch was in his pocket now as he sat across from the German prisoner. He could feel its weight there, a reminder of what waited for him if he survived. But he also knew that his work was destroying something inside him. Every interrogation, every execution, every decision about who lived and who died. He was becoming someone his wife would not recognize, someone who could look at a man and calculate whether that man was more valuable alive or dead without feeling anything. This was what the war required. This was what his duty demanded. But he wondered sometimes if the man who went home to Antonina would still be the man she had married. He stood up from the table and walked to the cellar door. He told the guard outside to bring Major Volkov from 62nd Army headquarters immediately. He told the guard to do it quietly, to make it look like a routine summons for a briefing. If Volkov was the traitor, any warning would send him running. If Volkov was innocent, any accusation would destroy his career and possibly his life. Abakumov had been wrong before. 2 months ago in Moscow, he had arrested a captain who had been denounced as a German agent. The evidence had seemed solid. Documents found in the captain's quarters that appeared to be coded messages. A witness who claimed to have seen the captain meeting with a German contact. Abakumov had recommended execution. The sentence was carried out. 3 weeks later, intelligence from other sources proved that the captain had been innocent. The documents had been planted by a rival officer who wanted his position. The witness had been coerced by that same officer. An innocent man had been shot because Abakumov had trusted evidence that turned out to be fabricated. He had not told Antonina about this when he wrote to her. He had not told anyone. The mistake had been buried in classified files, but he carried it with him. He saw the captain's face sometimes when he tried to sleep. He wondered how many other mistakes he had made, how many innocent men he had sent to their deaths because the evidence seemed convincing but was actually false. This was the burden of his work. He had to make decisions with incomplete information, and those decisions determined whether men lived or died. There was no margin for error, but errors were inevitable given the conditions under which SMERSH operated: the chaos of war, the pressure from Moscow for results, the difficulty of verifying information when records had been destroyed and witnesses were dead or scattered across thousands of kilometers of front line. The system did not acknowledge mistakes. Once a man was executed as a traitor, he remained a traitor in the official records, even if evidence later proved otherwise. To admit error would be to admit that SMERSH was fallible, that Soviet counterintelligence could be fooled, that innocent men were being killed by their own side. Such admissions were not permitted under Stalin's system. So Abakumov made his choices and lived with the consequences, and told no one about the doubts that kept him awake at night. He had learned to appear certain even when he felt uncertain. He had learned to speak with conviction even when he questioned his own judgment. This was what the job required. SMERSH officers who showed doubt were removed from their positions. Officers who questioned orders were investigated themselves. The organization demanded absolute confidence and absolute loyalty. Any hesitation was treated as potential disloyalty. Any questioning was treated as possible collaboration with the enemy. So Abakumov performed his role and buried his doubts and waited to see if Major Volkov would prove to be guilty or if this would be another mistake that would haunt him. Major Volkov arrived at the cellar 30 minutes later. He was a thin man in his late 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful posture of someone who spent his days analyzing radio intercepts. He saluted Abakumov and asked why he had been summoned. His voice was steady. His hands were not shaking. He showed no obvious signs of guilt or fear. Abakumov gestured to the chair and said there had been information leaks from 62nd Army headquarters. He said this was routine procedure, interviews with all officers who had access to classified documents. He watched Volkov's face carefully. He was looking for micro-expressions, tiny movements that might indicate deception. Volkov said he understood. He said he was happy to help with the investigation. Everything he said was exactly what an innocent man would say. Everything he said was also exactly what a skilled traitor would say if he had been trained by German intelligence to survive Soviet interrogation. The Abwehr was professional. Their intelligence officers understood Soviet interrogation techniques because they had studied them extensively. They knew that SMERSH looked for physical signs of stress, changes in voice pattern, verbal hesitations, so they trained their recruited agents to control these responses. They taught them how to appear calm under questioning. They taught them how to construct believable cover stories. They taught them how to pass Soviet security checks. The organization that Abakumov was fighting was not a collection of amateurs. It was a sophisticated intelligence service staffed by professionals who had been operating across Europe since before the war began. They had successfully penetrated British intelligence, French intelligence, Polish intelligence. They had recruited agents at the highest levels of Allied governments. The Soviet Union was just one more target. The Abwehr's Section 3, responsible for counterintelligence and sabotage operations, had established extensive networks inside Soviet territory. They recruited disaffected Soviet citizens who opposed Stalin's regime. They recruited ethnic minorities who resented Russian domination. They recruited opportunists who wanted money or believed Germany would win the war. They trained these recruits in espionage tradecraft, taught them how to gather intelligence, how to communicate with their handlers, how to survive if discovered. Many of their agents had been operating for years before the war began, establishing legitimate cover identities, building trust, waiting for the moment when they would be activated. Major Steinberg, the captured Abwehr officer, now sitting in the next room, represented this professional approach. He had been inserted into Soviet territory in 1940, more than a year before the German invasion. He had posed as a Ukrainian refugee fleeing from German-occupied Poland, travelling east with thousands of other displaced persons seeking safety in Soviet territory. His Russian was perfect because he had grown up in Russia, son of a German businessman who had lived in Moscow before the revolution and had fled to Germany in 1918 when the Bolsheviks nationalized foreign-owned companies. Steinberg had been born in Moscow, had spoken Russian as his first language, understood Soviet culture and mentality in ways that no amount of training could replicate. The Abwehr had recruited him in 1938 specifically because of this background, recognizing that his native fluency and cultural knowledge made him ideal for long-term deep cover operations inside Soviet Union. He understood Soviet bureaucracy, knew how to navigate the permit system, understood which officials could be bribed and which were incorruptible, knew how to blend into Soviet society without drawing attention. He had successfully obtained Soviet identity papers by bribing a clerk in Lvov who processed refugee documentation. The papers identified him as Mikhail Petrov, born in Kiev, evacuated from Ukraine ahead of German advance. He had established cover identity working in Soviet military logistics, translating captured German documents and helping Soviet quartermasters understand German supply systems. This position gave him access to information about Soviet military movements, defensive positions, supply routes. It also gave him perfect cover for his intelligence activities, since his job required him to ask questions about Soviet military operations. He had spent an entire year building his network before war started. He identified Soviet citizens who might be vulnerable to recruitment. He cultivated relationships slowly, carefully, never pushing too hard, always maintaining perfect cover. By June 1941, when Germany invaded, he had recruited 6 agents who provided him regular intelligence. His network had been operating successfully for 18 months, feeding valuable information to German forces advancing towards Stalingrad. The intelligence he provided had contributed to German tactical decisions that cost hundreds of Soviet lives. His reports had helped German artillery target Soviet defensive positions with precision. His analysis of Soviet supply routes had helped German forces interdict convoys bringing ammunition and food to besieged Soviet units. SMERSH had only discovered him because of random chance, a Soviet officer who had known his family in Moscow before the revolution and recognized him despite his different name and carefully constructed cover story. That single chance encounter, that moment of recognition in a crowded logistics office, had unraveled 18 months of careful intelligence work. But Steinberg knew that Abwehr had dozens of officers like him operating behind Soviet lines in various capacities. Even if his network was destroyed, even if all 6 of his recruited agents were captured and executed, other networks would continue their operations. This was the reality of the intelligence war. Individual operations might fail, but the broader institutional effort continued relentlessly. The Abwehr was constantly adapting its methods based on lessons learned from encounters with SMERSH. German intelligence studied reports from every captured agent who had been interrogated, analyzing which security procedures had failed and which had held up under Soviet questioning. They adjusted their training programs accordingly. They taught recruits new cover stories that would be harder for SMERSH to verify through records checks. They developed better forged documents that could pass closer scrutiny. They created more elaborate backup identities for agents who came under suspicion. When SMERSH developed new investigative techniques, the Abwehr analyzed them and developed countermeasures. When Soviet counterintelligence successfully broke a spy network by tracing connections between agents, German intelligence began compartmentalizing their networks more strictly, ensuring that agents in one cell had no knowledge of agents in other cells. When SMERSH proved effective at using prolonged surveillance to map complete operational chains, the Abwehr shortened the operational lifespan of their networks, extracting intelligence quickly and then shutting down operations before Soviet counterintelligence could identify all participants. German intelligence also exploited weaknesses in the Soviet system itself. They understood that SMERSH operated under intense political pressure to produce arrests, and that this pressure sometimes led to mistakes. They deliberately fed Soviet counterintelligence false information designed to make them investigate innocent Soviet officers, wasting SMERSH resources and creating paranoia that damaged Soviet military effectiveness. They planted forged documents suggesting that loyal Soviet officers were collaborating with Germany. They created fake communication patterns that resembled espionage, but were actually meaningless coincidences designed to trigger SMERSH investigations. They understood that Stalin's system encouraged denunciations, and that Soviet counterintelligence was under pressure to act on those denunciations even when evidence was thin. By manipulating these systemic vulnerabilities, German intelligence sometimes accomplished more through deception operations than through actual espionage networks. Abakumov knew all of this from Steinberg's interrogation. He knew that the Abwehr had dozens of officers like Steinberg operating behind Soviet lines. He knew that each officer probably controlled multiple agents. He knew that breaking one network would not stop German intelligence operations. New networks would be established. New agents would be recruited. New sources would be developed. This was a war without end, a constant struggle between Soviet counterintelligence and German intelligence. Every day, SMERSH identified new suspects. Every day, new arrests were made. Every day, new executions were carried out. The organization had grown rapidly since its creation in April 1943. It now had more than 600 officers working in counterintelligence. By next year, it would have more than 2,000. The work was constant. The enemy was professional. The stakes were absolute. Abakumov questioned Volkov for 2 hours. He asked about his movements, his contacts, his access to classified materials. He asked about his family background, his political beliefs, his opinions about the war. Volkov answered every question calmly and directly. He provided names of colleagues who could verify his statements. He offered to show classified document logs proving he had not accessed files without authorization. He said he had noticed unusual German artillery accuracy over recent weeks and had wondered himself if there might be a security breach. Everything he said was plausible. Nothing he said proved guilt. Nothing he said proved innocence. Then Abakumov asked the critical question. He asked if Volkov had ever been approached by German intelligence offering to help him escape to the West. He asked if anyone had suggested that cooperating with Germany might save more Soviet lives than continuing to fight. These were the questions that trained agents expected. These were the questions that would make a guilty man hesitate because he would be calculating whether SMERSH already knew the truth or whether they were fishing blindly. Volkov did not hesitate. He said no, he had never been approached. He said he believed in the Soviet cause. He said he had lost his brother at Smolensk in 1941 and wanted nothing more than to see Germany defeated. His voice remained steady. His hands remained still. His eyes met Abakumov's without wavering. He was either innocent or he was the best liar Abakumov had ever questioned. Abakumov made a decision. He would not arrest Volkov yet. He would put him under surveillance. He would assign 3 SMERSH officers to follow Volkov 24 hours a day. He would tap his telephone. He would read his mail. He would watch who he talked to, where he went, what he did when he thought he was alone. If Volkov was the traitor, the surveillance would eventually catch him making contact with German intelligence. If Volkov was innocent, the surveillance would prove it. This was how SMERSH operated. It did not rush to judgment. It built cases slowly, methodically, until the evidence was overwhelming. This approach required patience. It meant allowing suspected traitors to continue operating while under observation. It meant accepting that more information might leak before the network was completely rolled up. But it was the only way to be certain. The surveillance began that night. Lieutenant Grigory Orlov led the team. He was 26 years old, had worked counterintelligence since 1941. He was good at his job because he was patient and because he understood that most traitors were not obvious. They appeared normal. They did their work competently. They blended in. They waited for moments when they could pass information without being observed. For 3 days, Volkov did nothing suspicious. He arrived at headquarters at 7 every morning. He worked at his desk analyzing radio intercepts. He ate lunch in the officers' mess. He attended briefings in the afternoon. He left headquarters at 7 every evening. He walked to the barracks where he slept. He read for an hour before lights out. He spoke to colleagues but never held private conversations. He never used the telephone except for official calls. He never left the headquarters compound. On the 4th day, something changed. Volkov left headquarters at his usual time but turned left into a side street instead of walking to the barracks. This was not his normal route. Orlov signaled his team. One man followed on foot, keeping 50 meters back. The vehicle started its engine and moved into position to follow at a distance. Volkov walked for 3 blocks through the destroyed sections of the city where buildings had been reduced to rubble by German bombing. He was moving through areas where there were no streetlights, no witnesses, no oversight. He stopped at the ruins of what had been an apartment building. He looked around carefully, checking whether he was being followed. Then he stepped into the rubble and disappeared from view. Orlov's man on foot could not follow directly without being seen. He positioned himself 50 meters away behind the wreckage of a burned tank. He watched. He waited. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. Then Volkov emerged from the ruins. He was no longer carrying the document case he had been holding when he left headquarters. Orlov waited until Volkov was out of sight. Then he sent his man into the ruins to see what Volkov had left there. The SMERSH officer found the document case hidden under a section of collapsed wall. He opened it carefully, checking for booby traps. Inside were 12 pages of classified documents, defensive positions for the 62nd Army, artillery placements, radio frequencies, troop strength numbers, everything a German intelligence officer would need to plan an attack. The papers were marked with tomorrow's date. Volkov was planning to leave them overnight. Someone would pick them up before morning. This was how the leak had been happening. This was how Germans had been getting their information. Orlov sealed the documents in his coat and ran back to find Abakumov. They had found the traitor. They had the proof. Now they needed to catch whoever came to collect the documents. Abakumov studied the papers and made his decision. They would not arrest Volkov yet. They would let the handoff happen. They would see who came to collect the documents, follow that person, map the entire network. This was how SMERSH destroyed spy rings, not by arresting the first person they caught, but by letting the operation continue under observation until they could identify everyone involved. It required discipline. It required allowing a traitor to continue operating even after he had been identified. But it was the only way to be certain they had caught everyone. Abakumov put 4 men in position around the ruins. He told them to stay hidden, to observe but not interfere. He told them that whoever came to collect the documents should be followed, not arrested. The courier arrived at 4 in the morning. He was a Soviet soldier, a private in the 284th Rifle Division. He wore proper uniform with proper identification papers. He walked through the ruins casually, retrieved the document case, tucked it under his coat, and walked away. The SMERSH surveillance team followed him for 3 kilometers to a building that housed the division's logistics office. The soldier went inside, stayed for 20 minutes, left without the documents. The team now had 2 names: Major Dmitry Volkov, who was providing the information, Private Alexei Varsin, who was acting as courier, and someone inside the 284th Division's logistics office who was the next link in the chain. Abakumov kept the surveillance active. He needed to know where the documents went next. Over the next 2 days, the documents moved through 3 more hands, from the logistics office to a civilian truck driver who worked supply runs to rear areas, from the truck driver to a woman who ran a soup kitchen for Soviet soldiers near the front line, from the woman to a German-speaking Ukrainian translator who worked with Soviet units. The translator was the final link. He took the documents across the front line during a prisoner exchange, walking through no man's land under white flag with permission to negotiate return of wounded Soviet soldiers. He passed the documents to a German intelligence officer during the exchange, received payment in gold coins that he hid in his boot, walked back to Soviet lines. The entire operation took less than 20 minutes. Then he returned to his normal duties. No one suspected anything, but SMERSH was watching. Abakumov now had the complete network: 6 people, Volkov providing classified information, Varsin acting as courier, Captain Leonid Sokolov in logistics office acting as intermediary, truck driver Ivan Petrov providing transportation, soup kitchen operator Anna Fedorova providing cover, translator Mikhail Chernyshev making the actual handoff to German intelligence. Each person had specific role. Each knew only their direct contacts. If one was captured, they could only reveal 1 or 2 other names. This was professional espionage tradecraft. This was how Abwehr operated. Abakumov had to decide when to strike. If he arrested them now, he would break the network, but would not know if there were other networks operating in other Soviet units. If he waited longer, more information would leak, and more Soviet soldiers would die. During the 48 hours he waited, German artillery struck 3 Soviet defensive positions that had been described in the documents Volkov provided. 214 Soviet soldiers died in those attacks. The positions had been chosen because German intelligence knew exactly where Soviet forces were concentrated. The artillery fire was precise because German forward observers had perfect coordinates. The Soviet units were unable to retreat effectively because German machine gun positions blocked their withdrawal routes. This was what betrayal accomplished. Men died not because they had been defeated in combat, but because someone on their own side had sold their positions for money. Abakumov received the casualty reports and felt nothing. He had trained himself not to feel anything. Feeling guilt about deaths that happened while building his case would make him hesitate. Hesitation would let traitors escape. Some men would die now so that the network could be destroyed completely, and many more would be saved later. It was brutal mathematics. It was necessary. On the morning of November 3rd, 1942, SMERSH moved against the network. Simultaneous arrests at 6 locations across Stalingrad. Abakumov, personally arrested Volkov at his desk in 62nd Army headquarters. He placed a hand on his shoulder and said the words that every Soviet soldier feared. "You are under arrest for treason against the Soviet Union." Volkov went white. His hands started shaking. His careful composure shattered. He said nothing as Abakumov led him to the cellar where prisoners were held. When Abakumov came back an hour later to begin interrogation, Volkov was ready to talk. He said he had been recruited by Abwehr in 1940 when he was studying in Germany before the war. He said they had offered him money. He said he had agreed because he needed it to support his family. He said when Germany invaded, Abwehr contacted him and reminded him of his agreement. He said they threatened to expose him if he refused to work. He said he had been trapped. He said he had never wanted anyone to die. Abakumov let him finish. Then he told Volkov that he was lying. The Abwehr recruitment story might be true, but the rest was fabrication. Evidence showed that Volkov had been paid approximately 3,000 Reichsmarks over the past year, deposited in a numbered Swiss bank account that SMERSH had discovered through intercepted German communications. Volkov had not been victim of blackmail. He had been willing participant in espionage. He had sold information knowing exactly what the consequences would be. The law was clear. The penalty was death. Volkov broke down. He begged for mercy. He offered to work as double agent feeding false information to Germans. He offered to identify other Abwehr agents. He offered anything if SMERSH would spare his life. Abakumov told him that cooperation might reduce the harshness of his final hours, but would not change the ultimate verdict. The interrogation continued for 3 days. Volkov provided details about Abwehr recruitment methods, training procedures, payment systems. He named other Soviet citizens he knew were working for German intelligence, though SMERSH already had most of those names from other sources. By the end of the 3rd day, Abakumov had extracted everything useful. He filed his report with the military tribunal. The tribunal reviewed evidence for 6 hours. They found Volkov guilty of treason under Article 58, Paragraph 1b of the Criminal Code. They sentenced him to death by firing squad. The sentence was carried out the next morning. Volkov was taken to a courtyard behind SMERSH headquarters. A 5-man squad from NKVD special troops executed him. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. His name was removed from official records. His family was informed that he had died in combat defending Stalingrad. This was standard procedure for traitors. The other 5 members of the network were dealt with similarly. Vasin tried and executed. Sokolov tried and executed. Petrov tried and executed. Fedorova tried and executed. Chernyshev, the translator, attempted to escape. When SMERSH came to arrest him, he pulled a pistol and shot one officer before being killed by return fire. His body was searched. In his pockets, SMERSH found documents identifying him as Hauptmann Michael Schwartz of the Abwehr, a German intelligence officer who had been operating under deep cover in Soviet territory since 1940. He had been posing as Soviet citizen for more than 2 years. He had perfect Russian language skills and perfect Soviet identity papers. He had survived because he had never done anything to draw attention. The network he helped run had provided information that contributed to German tactical successes at Stalingrad for nearly 4 months. The elimination of the network reduced German intelligence accuracy significantly. SMERSH monitoring showed that German artillery fire became less precise in weeks after arrests. German forces began making tactical mistakes that suggested they no longer had reliable information about Soviet positions. But Abakumov knew that eliminating one network did not mean German intelligence had been defeated. Abwehr and SD would simply create new networks. They would recruit new agents. They would establish new communication channels. This was the nature of intelligence war. It never ended. Every day, SMERSH identified new suspects. Every day, new arrests were made. Every day, new executions were carried out. During the course of the war, SMERSH would investigate more than 200,000 Soviet soldiers and officers for suspected collaboration with enemy. Of those investigated, approximately 35,000 would be arrested. Of those arrested, approximately 14,000 would be executed. These numbers did not distinguish between genuine traitors and innocent men caught in machinery of Stalin's paranoia. They did not distinguish between those who had actively worked for German intelligence and those who had simply been denounced by rivals. SMERSH operated in an environment where accusation was often equivalent to proof. The organization became one of most feared institutions in Soviet Union, more terrifying to many Soviet soldiers than the German enemy they were fighting. Soldiers knew that single careless statement could lead to investigation. They knew that any criticism of Stalin could be interpreted as disloyalty. They knew that military setbacks might be blamed on sabotage, and that officers who lost battles might find themselves arrested by SMERSH rather than relieved through normal military channels. Viktor Abakumov himself embodied this contradiction. He was a skilled counterintelligence officer who genuinely worked to protect Soviet forces from German penetration. He was also a brutal enforcer who had participated in Stalin's purges and who had no compunction about executing men based on questionable evidence. He ran SMERSH with ruthless efficiency from 1943 until war ended in 1945. His organization expanded beyond hunting German spies. It also monitored Soviet soldiers for political reliability. It arrested Soviet prisoners of war liberated from German camps on suspicion they had been recruited by Abwehr during captivity. It arrested Soviet civilians in territories under German occupation on suspicion they had collaborated. It arrested entire ethnic groups suspected of disloyalty. After war ended, SMERSH was absorbed into MGB, Ministry of State Security, but its methods continued. Abakumov was appointed head of MGB and continued running counterintelligence operations, now focused on Western intelligence services rather than German ones. He remained in power until 1951 when he was arrested during one of Stalin's periodic purges of his own security apparatus. He was accused of fabricating evidence, executing innocent people, operating illegal surveillance network that spied on Stalin himself. He was tried, convicted, executed in 1954 after Stalin's death. His own organization used against him same techniques he had used against others. Confessions extracted through interrogation, accusations that could not be disproven. Secret trial with predetermined verdict. Bullet in back of head in prison courtyard. Body buried in unmarked grave. Name erased from records. The legacy of SMERSH remains controversial. Soviet sources portrayed it as heroic organization that saved Soviet Union from German espionage. Western sources portrayed it as terrorist organization that murdered innocent people. Both portrayals contain truth. Organization genuinely did catch German spies and disrupt enemy intelligence operations. It also genuinely did execute innocent people and operate as instrument of political terror. Exactly how many of 35,000 arrested were actual German agents versus innocent victims remains unknown. Soviet records were destroyed or remain classified. German records show Abwehr ran extensive intelligence operations inside Soviet Union, but do not provide complete lists of recruited agents. What is clear is that SMERSH operated in an environment where boundary between counterintelligence and political persecution was deliberately blurred. Stalin wanted organization that would hunt German spies, but also wanted organization that would enforce absolute loyalty to his regime. Abakumov built him that organization. It was effective as counterintelligence apparatus. It was also terrifying as instrument of political control. Soviet soldiers feared it almost as much as German enemy. Officers knew that military failure might lead not just to demotion, but to arrest and execution. Prisoners of war knew that liberation from German camps meant interrogation by SMERSH and possible deportation to Soviet labor camps. Organization succeeded in protecting military secrets and hunting enemy agents. It also succeeded in creating climate of fear that lasted long after war ended. In 2008, Russian Federation government erected monument in Moscow to fallen officers of Soviet military counterintelligence. Monument lists names of SMERSH officers killed during Great Patriotic War. Names of approximately 300 men who died hunting German spies and protecting Soviet forces from infiltration. Monument does not list names of 14,000 Soviet citizens executed by SMERSH during same period. It does not mention innocent men killed based on false accusations. It does not acknowledge that organization operated as instrument of terror as well as security. This selective memory reflects ongoing difficulty Russian society has with confronting full truth about Stalin's security apparatus. The people who worked for SMERSH were both protectors and persecutors. They caught real enemies. They also destroyed innocent lives. Both facts are true. Both deserve recognition. The case files from Volkov network investigation remain in Russian State Military Archive in Moscow. Documents show how SMERSH built its case, how surveillance was conducted, how interrogations were performed. Files also show that Abakumov had doubts about some executions he ordered, but suppressed those doubts because system did not permit uncertainty. In one classified memo written after war, Abakumov noted that approximately 30% of those executed by SMERSH were probably innocent, but that eliminating 70% who were guilty required accepting 30% collateral damage. This cold calculation defined organization's approach. It was willing to kill innocent people if doing so meant catching guilty ones. This was logic of total war combined with totalitarian political system. Result was effective counterintelligence combined with systematic injustice. The watch that Antonina gave Abakumov still exists. It was returned to her after his execution in 1954. She kept it until her death in 1983. Her daughter donated it to museum in 2010. Watch sits in display case in Moscow Museum devoted to history of Soviet security services. Small silver watch with inscription on back that reads, "Come home safe." Reminder that man who ran SMERSH was also man with wife who loved him, man who had made promises, man who carried weight of his decisions. Both truths exist simultaneously. Abakumov was dedicated officer protecting his country from infiltration. He was also willing participant in system that killed innocent people for political purposes. History does not allow us to choose one truth and ignore other. Both defined who he was and what SMERSH became. Today, SMERSH exists only in history books and classified archives. Its methods were absorbed into successor organizations that continued its work through Cold War and beyond. But its legacy persists. Russians who lived through Stalin's era remember fear of being denounced, fear of midnight arrests, fear that any mistake might be interpreted as treason. That fear was SMERSH's most lasting creation. Not the spy networks it broke or enemy agents it caught, but the terror it inspired in Soviet citizens who knew that organization charged with protecting them from external enemies was often more dangerous than the enemies themselves. That is the only certainty history can offer about organization that called itself death to spies. It brought death not just to spies but to anyone who fell under suspicion in system that valued security over justice. It brought death not just to spies but to anyone who fell under suspicion in a system that valued security over justice.